welcome to the RE Colloquium series. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Endre Begby. He's the chair of the philosophy department at St. Fraser University. Done a lot of interesting work on the social epistemology, particularly how it connects to some issues in language and also political philosophy. Wrote a monograph with OEP on prejudice, which great part of I highly recommend. And his talk today is going to be on fake news, so please join me in welcoming.
Right. So thank you so much. I've had the pleasure of meeting a few of you already. And those of you that I haven't met, thank you for coming to the talk. I hope you get a chance to chat later. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about fake news, and your immediate reaction might be to say something like, well, wasn't that like last year's topic? And I think it's true, right, that this kind of immediate sense of crisis, the fake news epidemic or whatever, that sort of seems to have waned quite a bit, which is a relief, of course. But on the other hand, I also think it provides us with an opportunity to look back a little bit and ask ourselves, how well did we really understand this phenomenon to begin with? So if you look at the literature, you'll find a lot of sort of analyses that affirm a very neat and tidy answer, attractive in its own right. So we're to think that fake news is a politically motivated intervention that was aimed at undermining our democratic institutions by way of undermining that sort of shared trust in a common body of information that democratic deliberation seems to depend on. It would work by exploiting democratic citizens' somewhat naive and gullible patterns of news consumption, right? So we are naturally trusting, let's say, and fake news presents itself as true, right? And it travels along communication channels that we usually take to be trustworthy. And so, despite the sometimes outrageous content, we often fall for the ruse, and then we form the false beliefs accordingly. And so, I think that false beliefs, presumably bad for deliberation, for decision making, whether we think of it at the individual level or the collective level. So in this sense, standard discussions of fake news tend to focus on fake news's potential to instill false beliefs or minimally to sow confusion or generate doubt or something like that. And if that's the way you're going to think about it, then it's very natural to also think that the right way to combat fake news is by deploying a kind of a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, you're going to want it to introduce institutional changes that are aimed at curbing the spread of fake news. And on the other hand, you want to develop awareness campaigns that are, aimed at improving people's cognitive resistance or immunity to fake news or whatever, so that they're less likely to be fooled next time around. So, since things have quieted down quite a bit now, it's tempting to think that this kind of combination of remedies actually worked, that we are now both less likely to be exposed to fake news, and also individually better, smarter, wiser, and so on in how we approach whatever fake news might still manage to sneak through the institutional barriers. So there might be some truth in this, but I think that with the benefit of hindsight, we can also find the time to try to explore an alternative account. And what I have in mind is an account that would try to probe a little bit deeper with respect to fake news' role in undermining democracy in particular. It would argue that fake news can have a significant detrimental impact on the quality of our democratic processes, even if it weren't designed to confuse anyone, to deceive anyone in the way that the standard account typically assumes. So here's what I have in mind. The way I do this thing is I'm going to just tell you right away what my conclusions are, what my argument is, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to fill in the bits. So if you feel like I'm restating the conclusion several times over, it's probably because I am, but hopefully every time it's going to be a little bit clearer what supports the view. Okay, so what I have in mind is that the quality of our democratic, or quality of our democracy depends on the quality of our public deliberations in an obvious way, and the quality of our public deliberations is going to depend in an obvious way on the quality of the information environment that we inhabit. by pumping large amounts of cheaply produced fake news, and that's a notion I'm going to come back to, into our communication channels, politically subversive agents can succeed in significantly altering what I'm going to call the signal-to-noise ratio in our information economy. And in doing so, they can significantly reduce the expected utility of engaging in public deliberation on the broadest and most inclusive platforms. It motivates us to turn towards narrower, more selective platforms where we can expect, more return on investment, higher signal-to-noise ratio, and that all but ensures that we're going to be pushed in a direction where we're more likely to interact with people who already share our cognitive outlooks and sense of value to a fairly high extent. So in this way, I think even low-quality fake news that's cheaply produced on a relevant scale can be a significant contributor to the process of belief polarization, which has well-documented detrimental impact on the quality of our democratic processes. Because what I'm going to argue is basically that it's the quantity and not the quality of the fake news that does the trick here. So I'm not going to say that there doesn't exist high-quality fake news, by which I mean the kind of fake news that might plausibly actually trick a fairly astute and rational observer. But intrinsically, it's going to be very hard to produce that on a scale that would actually have any significant plausible impact on democracy. By contrast, right, low-quality fake news might have similarly subversive ends, but can achieve those ends at a much lower cost. And empirically speaking, I think it's fair to say, I'm not going to argue for specifically here, but it's fair to say that most fake news is of a decidedly low quality or middling quality at best. Now, from one frame of mind, it's very tempting to think that low quality fake news is just a bad attempt at making high quality fake news, right? I'm going to argue to the contrary, that I think low quality fake news has its own sort of intrinsic rationale, and that rationale then is not to deceive or confuse us, but to create and exacerbate divisions in our political community. That's the idea that I'm going to try to argue. So I think that kind of account is going to have consequences not just for our understanding of the phenomenon, what fake news is, but I think also it can help shed some important critical light on the standard proposals for remedial strategies. So on the one hand, I think that attempting to curb the spread of fake news by way of imposing institutional measures like fact-checking or credentialing, so on, it comes at a certain cost, and I think it risks delegitimizing those platforms in the light of a number of users. I think that's especially true, right, in the case where the community is already, as it were, polarized to some extent or other, and already has sort of built itself around that distrust of the others that they kind of see coming with it. So that's one thing. On the other hand, I also want to say that the kind of public discourse that we sort of indulged in, centered on talking about a fake news epidemic and so on, might also have played its own part, I think, in creating a kind of ironic backlash here, where entrenching the idea that a significant proportion of your fellow citizens are essentially epistemically incompetent and are, disease vectors in the spreading of disinformation. You're also thereby kind of encouraging the idea that we might, epistemically speaking, we would do better to be extremely cautious about who we associate with. Epistemically speaking, that would be better off, shrinking our epistemic bubble to the point of becoming an echo chamber, effectively. So when we think about fake news, though, in terms of its power to persuade in this way, it's very natural to think of this as a matter of individual epistemic failing or frailty or something like that. But I think once we move past that perspective, which is what I'm trying to argue for here, then I think we can see, to the contrary, how the collective predicament that the fake news crisis brought with it may not be best understood in terms of failures of individual epistemic rationality at all. Rather, I think it can be seen in no small part as driven precisely by individuals' rather sensible preoccupation with maintaining, right, their own individual epistemic well-being, their intellectual hygiene, if you will, right, and what they now take to be antagonistic information environments. That's the sort of term of art that I'm trying to center my current work around. All right, so that's a brief overview of the whole paper. Now we're going to try to say it again more slowly. So a lot of, if you read some of this literature, you will kind of notice there's a tendency to always start with, definitions of fake news. Here's my definition. Here's how the different others. I'm not big on definitions. I think fake news might be a more complex phenomenon that resists a unique definition. I don't know. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I'm approaching this so that we can maybe forestall some confusion. So, if you take to heart the idea that fake news is politically motivated intervention of sorts, then I think we should accept the fact that there are a number of, highly organized disinformation campaigns out there that we wouldn't count as fake news. So what I have in mind would be things like celebrity gossip or transfer rumors during silly season in football. The reason, I think it's easy to miss the real reason why we wouldn't think of that as fake news. So one reason is, of course, that it doesn't have a political subject matter, right? But I think the deeper reason is that it doesn't target our political agency in the right sort of way. So that's the effect I want to look at. So as consumers of fabricated celebrity gossip stories, we're essentially powerless, right? What we think is not going to materially end up affecting how things go in the world, because there are no sort of established causal pathway by which our beliefs, whether true or false, is going to impact the way things turn out. So the dissemination of these stories is just a way of sort of trying to monetize our fandom. By contrast, I think the thing that we were concerned about a few years ago, this fake news epidemic, was precisely perceived as an organized attempt to affect the shape and the outcome of our political deliberations. And that's where I think fake news, or concerns about fake news, finds its very natural home in political settings, not just in terms of its topic and subject matter, but also in terms of the way that it targets our political agency. Finds its natural setting, specifically, of course, in the study of democracy, because democracies are the kinds of institutions that systematize this impact between public information sharing, joint deliberation, voting, and so on, and outcomes. Right? So it's in democracies that are engaging in these processes has, at least so we like to think, a direct say in who gets to wield the power and how they get to wield their power. So if that's right, then it shouldn't be a surprise to us that many different kinds of agents will want to try to manipulate those processes. And it's natural to think then about fake news as doing just that, right? Trying to either cause people to adopt new false beliefs or to become less confident in the beliefs that they already have. Either way, you're attempting to affect the outcome. All right, a little bit of a larger background. I might explain a bit about how I came to have these views as well. So, it's a peculiar fate of human beings that we're so epistemically dependent on others. This is pretty much, I take it, the sort of the founding insight of social epistemology that motivated this fairly big shift that we've seen over the last few decades. So considered as individuals, our access to information is really very poor. Most of what we can know, we can really only know about by way of our social relations to other people. That epistemic dependence introduces a kind of vulnerability that's founded on trust. I think that kind of vulnerability ought to be at the front and center of our understanding of epistemic normativity. It's really just part of the human condition. But not all manifestations of epistemic trust are going to be rational, right? So we might not be in a position to not trust, but we're called upon, we have a job to do, as it were, in figuring out whom to trust, the extent to which we trust them, how widely to distribute our trust, and so forth. So these are sort of standing challenges to us as epistemic agents. Right, so a lot of work in this area, and I should probably include some of my own here as well, permits itself to sort of simplify things a little bit when it comes to this point. The simplification or idealization, if you will, comes to something like this. We sort of permit ourselves to assume that these codependent epistemic agents have reason to think that others are acting collaboratively, right? So they are sharing their best information, they're generally looking out for each other's well-being. So we take ourselves to have a collective interest in finding out how things are. And we communicate honestly and openly and transparently with a view to sharing all of our information, thereby hopefully helping us all overcome the limitations that we suffer as individuals. So more recently, and the present work is one of, it's an expression of this. I've started moving more specifically towards political epistemology. And there's a very similar kind of idealization that is at work here. It's very common in the epistemology of democracy in particular. So if you read some of this literature, they will say things like, or rather, the question that many of them start from would be a question of the form, if we were to consider democracy simply as a collective deliberation and decision-making procedure, why should we assume that democracy does better, produces better political judgment, whatever, than competing electoral systems? And a standard answer to this question, this is what I call democratic optimism, let's say, is going to have it that we should expect democracy to produce better judgments because in a well-functioning democracy, information sharing and deliberation among citizens is going to be maximally inclusive. So it draws on the widest possible range of cognitive perspectives. So even though the average epistemic competence in a democracy might be lower than it would be, right, in some imagined alternative, more elite, select kind of electoral system, democracy more than compensates for that deficit by way of incorporating greater diversity. So that's the sort of thing you will find thinking Elizabeth Anderson and Ellen Landon Moore and many others as well. It's a very attractive view, right? In many ways, and I'm not going to try to argue for or against it here, but I want to bring to light this underlying idealization, which is that basically this view concedes that in order to vindicate democracy on epistemic terms, you're going to have to suppose that democratic citizens are willing and capable of engaging in information sharing and joint deliberation on the scale that theory supposes. Right? That this is an idealization, I don't think you can doubt, right? Because it's true that politics can be a venue for information sharing towards shared ends and so forth. But it's also a known fact that it often involves the direct opposite of that, right? Because politics is a battle for power and scarce resources. That's going to incentivize strategic communication that's aimed at undermining the political agency of others. And it's in recognition of that much of my current work is sort of centered around this idea that we need to develop an approach to epistemic normativity that's fit to guide us in these antagonistic information environments, right? Where you understand that part of your information might be good, part of your information is bad. You need strategies for coping with these facts. Right, so hopefully you can see how fake news would fit into this idea of antagonistic information environment. We haven't said anything so far about how it would work, and surveying the literature, the overwhelming assumption, right, is that it would work by targeting our first order beliefs or credences. So it's designed to deceive, and in this sense, right, it differs, from sloppy journalism, but it resembles, say, propaganda in being intended to deceive. The important difference just being that, propaganda is typically centralized, typically relies on the government apparatus or other aspects of the state, whereas fake news is decentralized and relies on peer-to-peer sharing or something like that. But that's the difference. So to the contrary, I'm going to argue then that much of fake news is plausibly not designed to deceive or confuse anyone, to change our minds in a certain way. Instead, I think there are design features of fake news that suggest that it steers by a very different kind of goal, roughly that of causing people to disengage from the political process altogether, or to engage in these processes only in a more selective, less inclusive kind of way. And while that is in some sense a less ambitious aim, I think still recognizably a politically corrosive kind of aim, I also think that it's an aim that is much more likely to succeed, at least on the scale that would be required. And in fact, I think it's an aim that has already to some extent succeeded, even as we now congratulate ourselves that we've sort of navigated past our first fake news epidemic or crisis, and that we are fitter, better, smarter than we were previously for the next round when it comes. Okay. So to see how we might move beyond the idea that fake news is designed to persuade or to mislead, consider your sort of standard basic sender-receiver model in communication theory. So the sender formulates and broadcasts a message. This comes at a certain cost. So we want to know why is the sender willing to undertake that cost? And the answer is typically going to be, right, that they want us to form a certain belief, namely the belief that forms the content of the message. This is simple stuff. So then we turn to the receiver side, right? And then we ask, well, first they're going to need to retrieve the message, to decode the message, then they're going to need to decide whether to believe the message. Now, most accounts here are going to assume that if the receiver is, as it were, tuning in at all, so if they're listening, then it's going to be because they have a disposition to trust the sender. Why is that? Well, there's already cost to listening, right? And so if they're listening, you got to suppose that it's because they think there's something valuable going on here, right? So they have, at least a minimum favorable disposition to trust what the speaker is about to say. Otherwise, there would be no reason to listen. So in a climate sort of marked by a suitable degree of epistemic trust, the supposition is that the mere fact that the sender is willing to undertake the cost of distributing the message already speaks in favor of forming the relevant belief, right? And so in the absence of countervailing considerations, it can be reasonable for the receiver to form that belief merely on the basis of the sender's having broadcast that message. So that's basically the position that's known in the epistemology of testimony as non-reductions, right? And it's more or less the standard template there. I just sort of retold the story in terms of sender-receiver models and communication theory instead. Now, some things, of course, are going to be different when you move from considering face-to-face communication to mass media messaging, but I think part of the model still can apply fairly readily, and that seems to apply quite easily to fake news. So what you got going on now is that the sender forms a message that they know to be false, that they pack it, right, in a clever manner so that it looks a bit like the real thing. They pack it in a manner that looks like traditional media communication. And traditional media communication has a certain kind of authority and prestige in our society. The receiver, being naturally trusting, right, is going to mistake the fake news for the real deal. They're going to form the corresponding belief accordingly. So all of this is very rudimentary. What I want from it is to point out that there's a kind of rationality assumption that's built into this whole thing. So because of the associated costs, we ought to assume that the message is going to be optimized for uptake, as I call it, by which I mean roughly that it's generally fit to persuade target audience. And I think that's where we're eventually going to run into it. Now, of course, some fake news might fit this bill. Of course, it's not incidental, I think, to fake news that is made to look a bit like real news. So they really do seem to be attempting to disguise their messages, at least up to a certain point, as real news bulletins. And that's, I keep reaching for this, but I'm not going to drink that. So they are, it looks like they are hoping to sort of piggyback on the prestige of institutionalized journalism in our society. And when it succeeds, it's plausible to think that it succeeds just because, right, it's able to exploit our trust in that institution, right? Because it has packaged its product in a sufficiently clever way so as to fool even a relatively astute observer. I take it that it's this kind of analysis that forms the starting point of most of these public awareness campaigns that we see, right? So these public awareness campaigns are, I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of them. They're designed to sort of give you a easily implementable checklist. And it's like, oh yeah, that seems interesting, so tell me. And then it'll say things like, is it written in good English? Is it published in one of the major news outlets? Is it credited to a named journalist or something like that? And you start thinking, well, okay, I kind of knew that already, so that's not my problem, right? But putatively, right, what these campaigns aim to do is to try to build our individual defenses against fake news so that we are less likely to be tricked next time around. And by contrast, right, fake news didn't aim to persuade in the first place, then it's really not that clear what these campaigns were really good for. So here's the point. I'm not convinced that all or even most of fake news was really ever aimed at persuasion in this sense. So to be sure, some people got fooled, and presumably these were the kind of people that might benefit from these kinds of public awareness campaigns. But specifically, that doesn't mean that we have, as it were, solved the problem of fake news whenever public immunity crosses a certain kind of threshold. That's the idea that I want to discourage here. So to see why, take another look at this kind of rationality assumption that underlies the standard model. So Regina Rini, in a very nice paper that I'll refer to more later as well, she points out that the puzzle here is that so much of this fake news is really so crude that it shouldn't be fit to persuade anyone, right? It basically looks more like trolling. It's like they want to be caught in the act of distributing it. So it doesn't look like an outright attempt at lying or misleading because they don't really seem to be disguising their facts at all. So I'm of the same impression, but that would be a very bad fit for the rationality assumptions that underlie the standard model, right? Because aiming for persuasion requires optimizing your message for plausible uptake on the receiver's end. But so much of fake news just doesn't seem to be optimized in this way at all. And so, you know, if the awareness campaigns were onto something, you would also think that the fake news creators would also sort of cotton onto it and be motivated to improve their product over time to try to fix these basic mistakes. So maybe we should like write better English next time. Maybe we should like have a byline name or something like that. But they don't seem particularly motivated to do that. And I'm at least not aware of any studies that document significant improvement to the quality of fake news over time. And that's puzzling. So the rationality assumption, I think, struggles on both ends here, right? It struggles on the senders, it struggles to explain how senders could assume that this message, packaged in this particular way, could be fit to persuade anyone. And it's going to struggle on the receiver end to explain how significant amounts of people could be so naive as to think that this is actually genuine. So at this point, I think it will be useful to compare the fake news phenomenon with another sort of internet-based scam that caused a bit of controversy or fury or whatever a few years ago, namely the so-called advance fee or pay upfront email scam. Some of you might know it as the Nigerian email scam or something like that, right? Many names. Many of you, I take it, are familiar with the basic form of the scam. So you receive an email claiming to be from some high-level government functionary or banker in war-torn country. They tell you that they have a significant amount of money stashed away in a bank account somewhere, but they're going to need help moving that money out. You're going to be part of, you're going to share this with me at, 60-40 or something like that. But in order to do that, I need to be able to transfer the money out of the country. But I need, outside money to pay the wire transfer fees. So please send me $1,000 for this bank account. So, like fake news, the advance fee email scam was widely distributed, apparently took some people in. And once it became known that it took some people in, you would then get public awareness campaigns that didn't look fundamentally unlike the ones that we saw with regard to fake news a few years later. Conceivably, these campaigns succeeded in reducing the absolute number of people that would fall for these, even if some people still do. I saw an estimate that $700,000 US are lost every year or something like that to these still. But go into that now. But I think what's interesting, the thing I want to get to is that you would think that in the face of these public awareness campaigns, the scammers would want to adapt their strategies so as to retain the upper hand, right? Because, but what you see is that the basic form of the scam really hasn't changed in 20 years. You still get the same emails, same, more or less the same content as you did all those years ago. So why haven't they updated their strategy, right? It seems like it would be a simple enough thing to do. And it seems like if you want to perpetrate a scam, why not do it well? Here's what I have in mind, right? So it's crucial for these people that the message be widely distributed. But there's a potential bottleneck on the other end that we need to keep in mind here, because any respondents are going to require substantial amounts of individualized handling before they're ready to commit to sending you the money. So there's going to be capacity limitations on the other side. So given the amount of extra work that you accrue whenever anyone actually responds, you'd be quickly overwhelmed if a large number of people actually responded. And that suggests that the transparency of the ruse is actually functional here, right? It's a feature, not a bug of the system. It acts as a filter, and it ensures that only people with, extremely low levels of epistemic self-awareness are going to respond to this. And of course, these are the people that you have the greatest chance of trying to pull over the line in the first place. And an improved initial ruse, that first email, would just be a less good filter in that sense, right? It would give you people that would be much harder to trick in the end. So what this means is that the advanced fee scam does clearly aim at persuasion, right? It wants people to believe false things, but it can afford to aim low because they really only need one person at a time to fall for it. And the less epistemically self-aware these people are, the better it is for you. By contrast, or rather, because of superficial similarities, it's then tempting for us to try to model our understanding of fake news on the model, on this advanced fee scam. But I think it's a bad model because the aims and expectations that ground sender rationality in the two cases are going to be very, very different. Because as a financial scam, the advanced fee scam aims at persuasion, but not wide persuasion, right? So it can be counted as a success even with very, very low rates of uptake. By contrast, and that's why we don't see a clear improvement to the product over time. But as a political intervention, fake news can't just aim to persuade one or two persons at a time, right? It needs to move a critical amount of people for it to have any kind of effect. And as such, if it were aiming to persuade, you should expect to see a continuous improvement to the product over time. But apparently we don't see that any more than we do with the advanced fee scam. So if you want to retain a basic sense of sender rationality here, this is something that requires an explanation. And here's, of course, the explanation. Try to explore that fake news doesn't really aim at persuasion, or much of it, at least, doesn't aim at persuasion in the first place. Right. But if it doesn't aim at persuasion, what's the point? My take on it is that fake news can have political efficacy by way of reducing the signal to noise ratio in our information economy, thereby making sustained engagement in information sharing and joint deliberation less rewarding, therefore less likely to happen on the scale that we aspire to and I assume is essential for democratic processes to deliver on their epistemic promise. All right, so again, engaging in joint information sharing and public deliberation requires effort. We measure the degree of effort that's required in part in terms of the cognitive costs of retrieving the signal. That cognitive cost in turn is measured with reference to the signal to noise ratio. You can think of like the signal as the information that you're trying to, or knowledge, if you will, that you stand to gain as a result of decoding the message. The important thing here is that, there will at all times be a certain amount of noise that's mixed in with the signal. So we can imagine the noise floor to be higher or lower, but I don't think we can plausibly imagine the noise floor being reduced to zero, because effectively I think about noise as a pervasive element in any kind of public epistemology, whether it's social, political, whatever it is. This noise is going to come from confusion. It's going to come from misdirection, from copying error, from bad attention span. It can come from anywhere. But the point I want to get to now is, of course, that part of it could also be intentionally placed there with a view to diluting the signal so as to make it harder to retrieve. All right, so the rationality of engaging in these kinds of processes is presumably not independent then of the underlying cost-benefit analysis, and you can roughly think about the cost-benefit analysis in terms of the expected value of retrieving the signal versus the cost of filtering out the noise. And I think this is politically relevant for the following reason, namely that the quality of our democratic decision-making processes are going to depend on high levels of engagement across a wide range of demographics. And for this to happen, we're going to rely on good channels of communication, good platforms for joint deliberation. So how well these channels work is, of course, then in part measured by the signal or the ratio of signal to noise that they carry. And so by substantially increasing the noise floor, we can succeed in making these communication channels just less viable for broad political engagement. So this kind of alternative model can help explain the prevalence of distinctively low quality fake news without sacrificing the underlying rationality assumptions, because creating fake news that's fit to persuade a critical mass of voters is always going to be hard, intrinsically hard. By contrast, it's going to be comparatively easy to just manufacture large amounts of disinformation, pump it out there. And as such, I think the strategy can succeed in achieving politically corrosive aim at a much lower cost. I think its chances of success too are going to be much greater. So we can imagine a spectrum of different outcomes here. So one would be, of course, that people just give up on the whole business of political participation altogether. They declare that all politics is bullshit and sort of engage in a kind of a ritual act of self-disenfranchisement, if you will. But I don't think that's the only possible outcome, right? One other outcome would be that we remain politically active or engaged, but we withdraw from these most inclusive and open-ended fora in favor then of narrower, more selective platforms where we can expect a higher signal to noise ratio and therefore a higher return on our investments as we engage here. That would, of course, entail foregoing the presumptive epistemic benefits of maximally inclusive deliberation, instead retreating to what Cass Sunstein in an important early paper on this called enclave deliberation. So that's a pattern where we end up basically only sharing information with people who already share our basic sense of value and our broad political outlooks. So as these kinds of peer groups, these enclaves consolidate, it's natural to call the product of that process an echo chamber. And we might expect to see patterns of belief polarization emerge over time. So different groups, enclaves, are now going to be progressively more convinced that their views are right simply as a result of being primarily engaged with views that resemble their own. As a result, you're going to expect to see these groups starting to grow apart, each moving in a more extreme direction. Jointly, they're going to be leaving behind that yawning gap where the moderate opinion was supposed to be. And that's supposed to be bad news for the epistemology of democracy because it's in that moderate opinion, presumably, that the workable compromise is supposed to be. Now, in my view, that would be a significant political end if you could achieve it. And as such, we shouldn't be surprised to see subversive agents try, as it were, to achieve that end. But notice how it seemingly can be achieved without, causing anyone to adopt particular new beliefs or causing them to become less confident in the beliefs that they already have. Say a bit more about that now next. So, because I'm not the first philosopher to sort of suggest that fake news might be taking aim at the quality of our information environment rather than try to persuade us of particular beliefs, right? So the whole literature has taken a very strong turn in that direction in the last few years. So the whole literature is now just awash with these kinds of environmental metaphors like epistemic pollution and flooding and so forth. Right? And, similarities are clearly there to see, right? A polluted epistemic environment is a noisy epistemic environment, not turning out. Nonetheless, I think there's important differences to where the analyses tend to go after that, because it's going to turn out that a lot of these accounts are still going to propose to measure the success of fake news in terms of its effects on our beliefs and credences, basically. So instead of simply looking at its ability to instill new false beliefs, they're now expanding to consider fake news also in terms of its ability to, sow doubt, generate confusion, and so forth. And that's clearly an improvement, right, over an older model, but it's still recognizably a matter of measuring success in terms of impact on beliefs and credences. So I think, the sharpest analysis here maybe is that of Regina Rini, who sort of pitches the idea of fake news in terms of the aim of weaponizing skepticism. It's a tremendously catchy phrase. So there's a quote, yeah, it should be on your handout somewhere. She says, the point of these campaigns was not to gain belief in any one falsehood, but to saturate the epistemic environment with conflicting accounts, so that the truth appears to be only one of so many bickering narratives. So the goal is confusion and disarray, generalized skepticism rather than focused false belief. So before moving on, I want to say this paper is really, really good. It's something I've learned a lot from reading, and particularly I think she has this little sort of capsule history of fake news, empirical portions, tremendously good. Read, very, very thorough. If you're interested, I very much recommend you read it. So I'm going to take issue with the epistemological upshot of her analysis, this idea of confusion and disarray, generalized skepticism rather than focused false belief. Because I think there's really two rather different kinds of outcomes that are being run together in these analyses that yield two rather different kinds of predictions about how agents would behave after that. But importantly, I don't think either of these outcomes actually maps onto what I have in mind in this particular paper. So that's what I'm going to try to get to. So first, focus on this confusion and disarray / general skepticism idea. Right? So I want to call attention to a distinction between something you might call a state of suspended belief on the one hand, and a state of skepticism proper on the other hand, or cynicism perhaps. It's a more natural statement. So in a case of suspended belief, I might take all contributions to a particular debate to be perfectly informative or evidential, right? It just so happens that on my current tally, it seems like views on this side and views on that side more or less cancel each other out. That does leave me in a certain kind of disarray. Like, I don't know what to believe. I would like to believe something, but I have nothing here to believe. So the important thing, though, to note is that I'm still perfectly open to the possibility that further contributions traveling along this channel are going to decisively tilt the balance of evidence in favor of one view rather than the other. And because of that belief, I'm going to stay tuned in, right? Precisely because I think there's real potential value to the signal that is transmitted here. Now, that seems to be different, right, from skepticism or cynicism, properly so called, because here you don't just come out thinking that as a matter of fact, my current balance of evidence does not favor P over not P. Instead, you come out thinking that really none of this here is evidence at all, right? It's this whole domain of discourse is really just bullshit, right? It's all noise and no signal. So whereas suspended belief should motivate you to stay tuned into the channel because you think that there's potentially valuable things to be learned there, skepticism should motivate you to tune out because you think there's nothing to learn. So for an illustration, I'm going to invite you to consider public messaging regarding the health benefits of masking, say, during the early COVID pandemic. That would be a classic case in point. So we had, different experts all giving us different kinds of advice, seemingly, huge disagreement between them. One way of responding to this would be to say, look, I don't know what to think, but I do think that these people are all genuine experts. The reason they disagree is not because they're not experts, but because it's really hard to know the truth about these things. So we should have some degree of patience here. We should stay tuned in because it's perfectly possible that soon we will see a convergence of opinion one way or the other, and that would be valuable for us to know about. But I'm sure you're also familiar with a very different take on the situation where people said, look, regardless of their scientific credentials, none of these people are speaking from knowledge. They're just, virtue signaling or trying to get their 5 minutes of fame, whatever, right? So, we don't stand to gain anything other than frustration and anger from listening to what these people are saying, because they're not, as it were, speaking from knowledge at all. But then I want to say these are not the two only options, right? Because I think there's a third option that's also very familiar here, and at least as common. So on this option, you sort of quickly settle into a groove where you settle into what you take to be the right view. And you settle into a groove where you primarily communicate with other people who hold a similar view. And then soon enough, you're going to come to think of the people who hold the opposite view are not just wrong, not just epistemically misguided. Maybe you can also think that they're kind of morally corrupt, right? Like the reason they're evaluating the evidence in the way that they're doing is because they have the wrong value set, right? So they might be valuing their own minor personal freedoms over the health of vulnerable populations, or you might think that they are sheeple that are only too happy to let governmental organizations use a public health crisis as a pretext for grabbing more power and so forth. So I think it's this third type of option, right, that is typically missing from standard accounts of the effects of fake news, that I think is a common and fairly predictable effect of it. Because clearly, a lot of us don't, suddenly acquire new false beliefs as a result of exposure to fake news, nor do we abandon our pre-existing beliefs because we've suddenly come to think that our evidential situation is so much more complicated, nor do we come to think that there's no value to having beliefs of any kind here. So we can ask, all right, were we just the ones who were lucky to be naturally immune to fake news? Or should we think that we were just a little bit smarter, a little bit more rational than the other people? Should we think that we suffered no bad results, no bad effects as a result? So that seems naive to me, right? Because I think even if fake news doesn't have a direct impact on our cognitive lives, it can still impact the quality of our information environment, thereby over time will have a predictable detrimental impact on our political agency. So by altering the signal to noise ratio in our information economy at large, fake news can change the incentives for engaging in political discourse on broad and inclusive platforms. So even if it doesn't invite us to take on the skeptical stance that all politics is bullshit, it can effectively force information sharing and deliberation through our underground. That is to say, it motivates us to seek out information sharing platforms and networks in which you can expect a higher signal to noise ratio. These networks are naturally going to be shaped by pre-existing social bonds and naturally gravitate towards those that you already share opinions and values with. And that's just to say that fake news moves us in the direction of enclave deliberation, ultimately to echo chamber formation, where certain kinds of perspectives, sources of information are just going to be filtered out altogether. Now, of course, there's some point of view in which you want to say that's could be a good thing, right? Because if you filter out all the crap, then we can focus on the properly credentialed opinions that are more likely to be true. Sure, maybe. But then you at least have to admit that the same argument is going to be given on the other side of the political spectrum. And I think that's precisely the way in which echo chambering leads to belief polarization, right? As a result of which we become on both sides of that spectrum more, not less convinced that we are right, that they are wrong. And precisely because they are wrong, we don't have to take their views into serious account. We can just dismiss them. Now, these results, I think, are recognizably consistent with us retaining our political beliefs, in fact, strengthening them on a certain metric, but also wielding potentially corrosive political effects in our shared environment and on our willingness to engage in open-minded, maximally inclusive deliberation informed by shared values. So in other words, it undermines democracy's ability to realize its epistemic potential, thereby, in turn, undermining our political agency. Moreover, I think this has nothing in particular to do with individual epistemic rationality, as is often presupposed here, specifically in these public awareness campaigns, but also in much of the literature on echo chambering and belief polarization too. Of course, that it has something to do with individual epistemic rationality is a very natural hypothesis if you think that the point of fake news is to target our first order beliefs or credences, right? Which is the standard assumption to start out with. But if you come around to thinking that its aim is rather sort of to divide us as a political community, then you get a very different view as a result, because now you might recognize that the collective predicament of belief polarization can be seen as the result precisely of individuals trying to implement relevant epistemic norms in the particular kind of information environment that they find themselves in, namely antagonistic information environments. And that would also suggest that them taking it to be so is in no small part a result of high-profile talk about a fake news crisis, fake news epidemic, and so on, which implicitly encourages us to think about other people as epistemically incompetent, as disease vectors, and so on, so that we have to be very, very selective about who we trust and who we engage in, sincerely engage in informing our political outlooks. So basically, that forms a sort of a public health advice to basically go out there and form, very, very small epistemic bubbles, and then we're surprised to see what the outcome is, then we shouldn't be. All right, so I was told that I could speak for up to 1 hour, so I have one more little angle that I want to play, namely the question on everyone's mind. Namely, why does fake news thrive on social media in particular? Just like you cannot write a paper on this without having a definition of fake news, you also cannot write a paper on this without having a concluding section about social media apparently. So I'm going to play my bit here. So obviously we shouldn't be misled here. There was fake news before there was the internet. Nonetheless, there seems to be a wide consensus in the literature that there's something peculiar about social media that seems particularly vulnerable to being overrun by fake news. And we want to know what that is. Again, answers seem to focus on the persuasive power of fake news, leading us to speculate about why people seem to be so much more gullible on social media than elsewhere. So one, popular view out there would be, of course, that social media just somehow magically makes us stupid, brings out the worst in us. But you have more sophisticated analyses also. Again, Regina Rini, in an earlier paper, wrote about this, and she sort of argued in a very roundabout way that the trick about social media and disinformation is that the peer-to-peer structure of social media interactions succeed in mimicking ordinary face-to-face interactions to a sufficient degree that we somehow drop our guard and become less critical than we would be of political discourse if that political discourse occurred on any other kind of a platform, right? So it feels more like you're talking to your peers directly than consuming news that's given to you from some anonymous place elsewhere. So that's her. My view. Once again, I think we've fallen for this temptation of focusing on individual cognitive behaviors. And again, I'm thinking that's a bit of a distraction. Instead, I think fake news thrives on social media for exactly the same reason that we might once have hoped that ground level democratic processes might have thrive on social media. So I'm going to try to explain to you what I mean by this. So consider a kind of typical optimistic perspective on social media and democratic engagement from like 20, 25 years ago or something like that. I was there at the time, so I know about it. So, let's say we were interviewing someone on TV and asking them like, could social media be an important factor in securing the future of democracy? Like, could it encourage political engagement? Could it strengthen our ground level processes and so on? And the person being interviewed would say, like, yes, very much so, because everyone knows, right, that democracy has a participation problem. Democracy depends on high fidelity, low barrier channels of communication and platforms for joint deliberation. It works best when it works in this maximally inclusive way, where, so far as it's possible, everyone's opinions gets thrown into the mix. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what your social network is, otherwise you all get to be part of this. So it's an obstacle to our democracy currently, says the guy from 20 years ago, that it imposes these kinds of high barriers on effective participation. So for democracy to really, be ushered into the new age, for it to really deliver on its promise, we need access to broadly inclusive, decentralized peer-to-peer networks where political opinions can be offered at no cost in real time, debated, and so forth. And that, of course, is precisely what social media seems to offer. So in hindsight, you might think, well, there's some naive techno optimism right there. But I think it's important to ask yourself what might have happened in the meantime, because notice how the same mechanism then that would make social media potentially promising or valuable to the epistemology of democracy, you should expect that it would also then make it an important target for politically subversive campaigns. but also particularly vulnerable to such campaigns precisely because the barrier is so low, right? Because it's so cheap to participate there. Now, of course, we can add that the essentially decentralized character of social media makes monitoring for information quality very difficult. So we could think then about, well, what about imposing centralized fact-checking, quality control, something like that. But of course, that's also then going to detract from its value as a maximally inclusive forum for political engagement, to say nothing of the actual quality of this kind of fact-checking when it's done in real time, at least. These news come out continuously, and you might not be in a position to say what of this is fake news and what of this is a legitimate perspective for another while yet, right? There's that. There's also the question, of course, whether these fact-checking mechanisms are going to be widely seen to be objective and unbiased in a political environment that's already significantly marked by belief polarization. Of course, it's a familiar dynamic that perceived political bias in these kinds of institutional constraints is likely to just push partisans underground, right, to other platforms, which will thereby just give another spin to the cycles of the polarization. So if they're thrown off Twitter, they're going to go to some other platform and so on, where they're just going to see people of their own kind. So with all that in mind, you can then sort of think about different possible strategies that politically subversive agents might want to deploy if they were looking to disrupt baseline political processes in the social media era. So they could engage in a select campaign of high quality disinformation, right? Hoping to acquire a broad readership, hoping maybe to trick some people into believing the truth of what they say. Or they could do a perfunctory cost-benefit analysis and instead just decide to just pump in enormous amounts of low-quality disinformation to disrupt the channels of peer-to-peer communication. As I've argued, this kind of low-quality fake news might not be fit to persuade anyone, but also that is not his point, right? Instead, it has the benefit of just being cheap and being easy, and can plausibly succeed in the nearby aim of disrupting that easy opportunity that social media seem to provide for high-quality political engagement. Of course, we don't have to suppose that this is a question of either or. Obviously, we can suppose, probably we should suppose, that these kinds of agents will want to, make use of both of these strategies. But my point is simply that it would be remarkable if they did not also want to avail themselves of this cheaper strategy, just because it offers relevantly similar rewards at a much lower cost. All right, so I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just take a quick 3 or 4 minute break and reconvene for the Q&A. If you want to be on the queue, just please catch my eye. I also just want gentle reminder, this is relatively early in our conferences. Try not to ask too long, convoluted questions. That's very hard for the speaker to answer, as we all know from being speakers. And if you have multiple questions, just ask to come on the list multiple times, and then we can go. So, Paul, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
This is my bread and butter. We agree a lot on this. I came in here.
Oh, so you're Paul.
Yeah, I'm Paul.
Yeah.
I came here ready to rumble,
Okay.
and I'm not gonna have to. It's gonna be interesting to see how fake news develops with when people become more and more comfortable using AI and being able, and it seems to, it would speak to your view if we don't see a big jump in the quality of deepfakes and things like that. But my one worry about your analysis is I think there's a large portion of fake news providers that it wouldn't work for. So I'm thinking about those that aren't really interested in persuasion, political persuasion, but instead are financially motivated, where they just want to maximize clicks and shares.
The Macedonian teenagers?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it seems to me that if it would be against their best interest for people to drown out the norms, right? And it seems to me that, what was I going to say? I lost my thought.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's an alternative account of why fake news has remained at a low level. And one is just the rising distrust in traditional media in general. That maybe it's like a bonus that something doesn't appear to be official news. It's like, oh, good, I can, I can avoid that fake news and finally get to the truth of these people, these warriors for truth, these underground warriors. So why not that sort of?
So that's 3 questions.
Oh, I'm
really
Thank you.
So the ChatGPT question I think is super interesting, and I want to get back to that because I'm sure someone else might want to ask.
Right, yeah.
The Macedonian teenagers and the motivation of not being, as it were, politically motivated at all, but just financially. I think that's entirely true. And this little bit where I started talking about football transfer rumors and so on, I also had a footnote in which I say, so that means that there are in fact politically contentful fake news campaigns that aren't fake news in that sense because they just sort of monetize. Yeah.
So you're not counting that.
I mean, it's not like I'm not counting it by definition. I'm just saying it doesn't fit with the standard analysis. Moreover, that's not a problem for my analysis because it's got other very, very straightforward ways of explaining that. And I like to go via the kind of analysis that someone like Michael Hannon has proposed recently of, understanding a number of these sort of public political processes in terms of fandom, in terms of choosing a side, rather than political persuasion. So I think that's kind of what's going on here. A lot of our political agency really is that of rooting for a sports team. And the Macedonian teenager stuff stands to that as celebrity gossip. It's not, it's just playing a very different game. The fact that we like to be engaging in sort of grotesque fanfic about politicians and like to read that, but no one reads it for truth content or very deep. So I think it's a parallel phenomenon that again looks like fake news but isn't. Of course, you're free to define it the way you will.
Just a lot of people do, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So with respect to the final question, I don't really know what to say. Would these be people that are so far gone that
Not necessarily so far gone. So I agree with you that it's not necessarily about individual rationality.
Yeah.
I like to think of it in terms of epistemic trust relations.
Yeah.
And the sort of poisoning against typically trustworthy sources of political information, along with the presence of fake news that actually look like news, and the propagandic use of the word fake news to
Okay, cool. So I'm not really looking for, I mean, this is my cheap way out, but I think it's right. I'm not looking for, full coverage analysis. I'm looking to pull out a phenomenon that I think is central to the, or an aspect that I think is central to the phenomenon, but hasn't been well covered in the literature. But that doesn't cover all the manifestations of this at all. I'm happy to discuss these other things.
I'll take it.
Cool.
So I had a question about your objection to the sender-receiver model. On the handout you have, while some fake news might be sufficiently clearly disguised that it could pass for the real thing, a lot of it is plainly bogus.
Yeah.
My question was plainly bogus to whom? You made reference to an astute observer while you voiced this objection. And depending on how that's understood, I'd be happy to grant that astute observers will be able to discern fake news from real news. But I would submit that a decent portion of the sorts of populations that we care about, for example, the American electorate, will not be astute enough to discern fake news from real news, even the fake news that we would all think is plainly bogus. So why do you think that's wrong?
That's where I'm thinking you're wrong. So I mean, I do know that there are tons and tons of sociological studies out there that say 76% of Americans will say that Donald Trump's election numbers are greater than such and such, this kind of stuff. But if you go and ask yourself, how likely are these questionnaires to track the truth about their actual beliefs? Are they just signaling their partisan allegiance? There's no incentive for them, right, to answer truthfully to these things. My take on it is there's very little evidence going on here that these people actually believe it. So there are some studies that I find fascinating. I think the jury is out about how good this is too, but the simple idea is just to try to provide some kind, or try to change the incentive structures a tiny little bit, so that you now have reason to answer truthfully. Right. So let's say, give you gift cards or something So now you stand to get a $250 gift card if you answer the actual truth. Rank these on a Likert scale of 5. And then you're going to start to see a convergence of answers across partisan divides. Only by providing a minor financial incentive that suggests, doesn't probatively show us, but it suggests that these people don't actually believe this, at least not to a relevantly high degree of credence. They're answering as if they believe it because it's a big fat fuck you to the idiot academic on the other end who's taking up your time. That's right.
Yeah.
That's basically the idea.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that, suppose that's true for the vast majority of people. Let's say there's still 5% of people, Grandpa Joe out on the farm.
Sure.
5% of people
Yep.
in the American electorate, that's a big deal. If we can convince 5% of people.
Is this the second question or yeah, sure. But these people didn't need that fake news to end up with those beliefs in the first place, is what I'm thinking. So we could think, and there are some studies now. I've been trying to track the genesis of the QAnon phenomenon a little bit and try to understand the recruitment patterns a little bit better and so on. But they're not recruiting people off the street, right? They're recruiting a self-selected batch of people who already have these kinds of beliefs. This is the point at which this is going to start interacting with psychopathology and various other things. And yeah, I don't think this is the kind of thing that's just going to come at people unaware, and then suddenly they're going to think that Hillary Clinton is running pedophile prostitution rings from pizza joints in Washington, D.C. and so on. You got to be predisposed to believe in this in the first place. That's my thing. It's not because you think media is generally a good conduit of information that you believe this.
I have a tiny question associated to this point, actually. So, certainly take your point that must build on some sort of antecedent belief that people have. But I wonder if having it as a kind of public form of use does give a shared social basis that reinforces it to a degree that just wouldn't be present, perhaps, without it. I mean, it makes, as you're sort of saying, a key insight of social epistemology is how relationally. So I think that's also true of bad and distorted, but we can say, okay, I think this, and I'm part of this big online community that recognizes that Hillary Clinton's a bloodsucker, and we talk and post. So I think it can reflect it, but I think it can also massively amplify it, and that does seem like a salient.
Yeah, I do think so. That repeated exposure might do better, who knows? But that still leaves the question, like, what is it about the content that was supposed to be? Because if the content was not there to be believed in the first place, then seeing it over and over again is not going to do anything either. Maybe there is something, and this is the kind of thing that Regina Arini would have said in that earlier paper, there is something to the fact of seeing enough people share the story, which indicates to you that they at least think that it passes some kind of minimal muster, right? That strengthens the case for it, because now you get sort of the implicit testimony that comes with the sharing. So that doesn't make the story intrinsically more believable, but it does mean that here are some people whose opinions I can more trust and so on. Right. That would do that. So yeah, sure. That exists, but that's also perfectly compatible with the view that I take, that what happens when you see it over and over again is just that that's the measure of the extent to which it has intruded on your communication channels and is now blocking out all the content that could be there instead.
Do you have a follow-up question?
I don't know. I'll go browse this day on my list.
Okay. Star next.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. So my understanding of your point is that, okay, fake news is a cheap and easy way to divide without having to do the heavy work of convincing people or even confusing people. But I'm having a really hard time shaking this worry that like confusion is part of dividing people, and maybe it's because there's two different kinds of confusion. Like it seems like Rainey's talking about confusion about like whether I should or should not believe P, but there's also confusion like uncertainty, which seems to be like a huge part of the motivation for like a lot of reactionary politics, right? Like, I'm thinking about a case like, a grandma who reads a story that like kids in California are gonna have to start like wearing a name tag with their pronouns, right? And you're like, Grandma, that's not true. And she's like, well, I don't know, I don't care, but all I know is that I don't want to deal with any of this new stuff, right? it's really that confusion that she doesn't need to change her platform, she doesn't need to talk to new people, as long as she's just like, oh God, the future is scary and I don't know what's gonna happen.
exactly.
That's the source of the division.
That's interesting. So I think that's it's kind of orthogonal to the point that both Rena and I are making, but in a good and potentially productive way, right? Because it points out that there's more depth to the phenomenon even than that. So so I take it that something like this would be, you come into it thinking antecedently that the world's gone off its rails in a certain way, because like, who knows what to think about anything anymore. And then these stories reinforce that in a way, they don't persuade you about particular things that I don't know whether I should believe these people about the Russian invasion or those people, or I don't believe, you know, that kind of stuff. But it's more like a general sort of resigned outlook about how complicated the world has been and so on. Yeah, I wouldn't rule out that this can play a reinforcing part in that. And then do you become cynical? It's not like you then think everything's bullshit, but just like, I have no part in this anymore, or it's not for me to.
Well, just like, you know, I mean, I think it's really just like, if I change my political position, like, who knows how bad things could get. I mean, I kind of think that this is just how news works in general, right? Like, it's not really about convincing you to believe like some proposition P. It's often about like, make sure that you have some, it's like an effective dimension related to proposition P.
No, that's nice. Yeah, let's see. Think more about that, because I like the point.
Yeah, in a way, I want to return. So can you put me back on the bottom?
Sure.
And then questions about the negative part of the program and the positive part. So the negative part of the program, and this is just really following up on your exchange with Bridger and Matthew. So we're talking about moving the needle is a vanishingly small, like 5% would be huge, right? We just have to, these people, you know, if they're literally Russian and saying that they're going to do it, really just have to use this tiny percentage of the population. And two of the things that you were speaking to, so here are two words. One is when we're talking about, it doesn't even have to be that people are too stupid to see through, although they are. The very things that we pick up on as bugs are pointed to by them as features. So they will say, and I literally heard this, they will say things like, yeah, it's bad grammar, that's how you know that it's genuine. Yeah, it's like, doesn't make any sense, but that's why it has to be true, right? So it's not the things, so there's that. And then on the second point about critical mass, it's not only that the critical mass is really small, it occurred to me that on political questions, as opposed to Nigerian princes writing native, right? On political questions, there are structural features in American media that they make use of on a regular basis. And here's one of them, the notion that you have to tell, as it were, both sides, right? And they make use of exactly that feature to make these seem plausible and thereby persuade. I mean, this is how we got to Donald Trump. I mean, aside from him, right? But it seeming not insane for him to say there are fine people on both sides when one of the sides was Nazis, right?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So there's a couple of things in there. One is just how small of a portion of the voters do you need to move in order to have political effect and so on. That's not for us to decide in the room here right now. I think we might have different views about what it takes to affect outcomes in these elections. But I grant you, right, in particular selects, because it seems to be a fairly small number of people indeed. But targeting those specifically, I think, is a subtler art than we've been told by many people who are commentating on these issues. But that's an empirical issue that I don't think we're going to be able to see our way to the clear. With respect to the both sides now kind of thing, I completely agree, right? And I do think, so what does this go back to? This goes back to a Reagan era, 1976. Regulation that says that news media need to be unbiased in their coverage or something like that. And then the way to try to do this is to try to sell the idea that for every point, there's a equally legitimate counterpoint, or at least legitimate enough that needs to be heard, and so on. And that's why you then get the sort of incentivized media market for being the pundit who has the opposite view. So you're always going to be the guy who gets reeled into say, here's the opposition view. So implicitly then it sort of gives voice to the assumption that reasonable people are always going to disagree, or there's always going to be something for reasonable people to disagree about. And our current predicament very much reflects the structure of the way media narratives play out. Does that sound like a way of getting at some of what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just don't, I mean, I guess the worry is that that and the whole what's a feature, what's a bug,
Yeah.
just contribute to the thought that there's a lot more persuasive possibility in the kinds of things that seem to some of us insane.
Yeah.
than it would
All
seem
right,
at
fair
first
enough, fair
glance.
enough. But I still think that we do better by giving up on models that would try to explain that in terms of, communication directed at individuals, and rather try to explain that in terms of the social dynamics of groups of recipients. Groups of recipients that are now going to be restructuring themselves actively as a result of being the kinds of people who want to receive this kind of news or think this is at least worth debating. So there are going to be social level dynamics that ultimately explain why the groups move this way rather than that.
Right, so this is about your objection to the advanced fee scan model.
Yeah.
So like you say, we should expect to see fake news, unlike the advanced fee scan, become fitter and smarter over time. But it seems to me like we should only expect that if there aren't already fitter and smarter political scams out there. So like, I don't know, if you're talking about conservative fake news,
yeah,
well, we already have scams that are fitter and smarter. Like a level above, we've got Fox News, we've got OAN, a level above, we've got the National Review. The top level, we've got like the Federalist Society. What a scam, And so, like, it seems like that's the reason why these don't get better. It seems the same thing can be said about these advanced fee scams too. It's the rest of the market's cornered. There's already a ton of financial scams that are fitter and smarter. So it's just one, I don't know. It seems to me like there's a lot to this.
Okay. I would have to think, I mean, I don't think they're operating in the same market at all. They're not paying license to do, mass media broadcasting. I think that's different. So they're not competing in that market. Could they earn more money by more clicks? Yeah, of course they could. If on a certain view, there's no limit to the amount at which they could eat into that market, because there doesn't seem to be the highest limit to the amount of time we will want to spend clicking on these stories every day. So in the hard battle between clicking on cute cat pictures and clicking on politics, that's the way we want to spend our time on the internet, right? There doesn't seem to be any upper limit to the amount of politics that some people are willing to spend money on. I don't think they're directly competing with One American Network or traditional newscasters like that at all. And similarly with more elaborate financial scams as well. I mean, they have their own niche, but I think they could do, on certain suppositions, if there wasn't the same kind of bottleneck at the other end, they could potentially earn a lot more money. So going into the dating market is apparently the way they're doing it right now, via AI bots and stuff like that. So either voice controlled AI stuff and so on. So that is a new niche in that market where they've earned like, oh no, here we can actually earn more money in a dynamic sort of way, but still the Nigerian Prince emails keep coming because that seems to be its own little niche where the ceiling on earnings isn't really about how many possible people there are that you could get in, but really how efficiently we can process them on our end. So I want to stand by my point there, and I think there are intrinsic reasons. Although I get your point that one shouldn't be brazen and say things too quickly.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question about your question, because it's not clear to me that it's a good question.
Okay.
So the fundamental question, as I understood it, was what's the point, aim, or goal of fake news?
Yeah.
And it's not clear to me that fake news is the kind of thing that has a point, aim, or goal. So if I ask you what's the point, aim, or goal of fast food, it seems like, well, that's a weird question. Well, I think it has a goal. Well, I think it's the kind of thing that hasn't just one. I think it's the kind of thing that has goals at all. The people producing it have goals.
Yeah.
It has effects.
Okay,
There doesn't seem like.
but
it has
that is the
fake
question I'm asking.
And so-
Like,
so-
what is the point of using fake news? What's the point of putting it out there?
news. So what you're asking, what is the aim, goal, or point
Of putting this product out there?
for the people who are doing it?
Yes.
So that seems like just an empirical question. We need to,
And then we can do empirical informed analysis aided by philosophy in doing that, and that's what I try to do here. So I agree with you to some extent, right, that I don't think fake news is one thing. I think there are many possible lanes that one could have in trying to put this kind of stuff on the market. Some of the stuff might be high-end, high-quality stuff that could fool some people, and I see why you want to do that. But then the standard assumption would be that all this stuff is attempts at doing the good stuff. Just obviously four attempts, and then I'm suggesting, well, if that's what they were doing, then here are some templates for improving it, and you would expect that they would want to do that because it's easy to do. I just look at these public awareness campaigns with their 10-point checklists, and then you just try to meet those 10 points, and then you presumably doing better. So my suggestion then is based in part on empirical matters and part on philosophical reconstruction, that can't be what they're doing, because it wouldn't make any sense. But there is this other thing that they might be doing that would make sense. And here's what it is. So the question, yeah, sure, grammatically incorrect to ask what's the point of fake news? Better to ask what's the point of producing a certain kind of fake news?
and then the answer might be that people producing have lots of different goals. And we need to go do some empirical work to find out how many of them are saying different things. And then,
Yeah. And then in the paper, I would cite a lot of that empirical work, right?
Okay, but we, if we're in that terrain, we're no longer in the space of debating, well, is it this or is it this? Right, in the way that this project appeared to be suggested,
I don't see why,
right, because
I really don't see why they wouldn't be doing that. Like, you know, empirically speaking, it doesn't seem like they're doing this. What else could they be doing? Well, here's some plausible speculation. Of course, you know, it's not entirely an empirical test.
some of them might be doing what you're suggesting, some of them might be doing other.
Right?
George has a great follow-up question.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like, I don't know, I have a lot of, that's too much. I'm somebody who has a lot of grandpa jokes in my family, so I have a lot of thoughts on this stuff. I mean, like, I think following Adam's comments here, I think there's just like some kind of tricky thing about how the project's being framed as analysis of fake news generally. Because like for contrast, I think it might go down. I think it might go into those podcasts. I have some fringes in my family that I know listen to this podcast.
Mhm.
That does not seem like noise to me. That does not seem to match the characteristic of noise being off in this analysis. It seems rather that the kind of thing I would call noise here is a specific subset of fake news.
Okay, I don't know the particular show well enough to
It's
have
the
an
Mike
opinion.
guy. It's just like he's like a chemtrails guy, you know,
Okay, yeah.
like stuff like that. It seems to me like no, that is like a produced show
Yeah.
such that he's intentionally giving out false signals.
Yeah.
Which I think is a different kind of analysis.
Okay.
So that's more just a comment. I feel
This
like
is the idea that there's stuff out there that's genuinely entertaining,
Mhm.
and you might want to expose yourself to that, not because you want true beliefs, but you just think it's fun to listen to this kind of stuff.
Oh,
Because I do that all the time. I read conspiracy websites like crazy because I really genuinely think it's a fun and creative.
I
Sounds
agree
kind of
with that,
literature,
it's like
yeah.
personal. I mean, like, but like to use like how Paul's language is in his projects, I'm really that, like. What I think is really interesting and kind of like the passive distinction between misinformation versus disinformation, is like, no, I'm presenting you with false information. I want you to believe that false information, right? Like when this kind of trusting relation, like when somebody is seen as a trustable figure,
Yeah.
the Alex Jones phenomenon, a
Yeah.
great example of this. People trust him. People watch
Yep.
him in large part because they believe him.
Yep.
Which is a different kind of fake news than I think this analysis is offering.
Yeah.
That's all, that's just one.
Yeah, yeah,
comment.
but I mean, he's putting his name and his brand and his syndicate and his whole apparatus behind it, as opposed to the weird nameless anonymous emissions that started popping up in 2015, 2016, and then quickly swamped the internet. So we knew already what to do with the syndicated radio people. We had the corner on them. What we didn't know what to do anything about was all these other people, and it's a shame that we sort of crossed wires and started thinking about all of this as fake news at some point. But I'm thinking of the weird decentralized coming from nowhere in particular kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, like. I think the question and put us in question form is like, how would we distinguish these two different kinds of fake news? And like personally, as a different matter, I'm skeptical if you can do that cleanly, but I think that's just coming back to the point on definitions in the first place.
Cool. at that point, what I want to say is like, sure. What I have in mind is that there's this distinctive subphenomenon here, that if we were to sort of bring it to light, it might shed some interesting explanatory light on a lot of other stuff that's going on. So I think that's really what I'm doing. So it's not to say that there aren't other things that you might also want to call fake news, and you can ask about how these things relate to it.
James.
Yeah, so my question is very good follow-up to Josh, because I also think that like a lot of fake news really seems like signal, not noise.
Mhm.
And so you just briefly compared some fake news to trolling, like
Yeah.
in like an offhand.
Yeah, it was
in
a
your
quote from reading. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's worth exploring. So I have no sources to back this up. I've heard the claim repeated often
Yeah.
that unmoderated forums get taken over by the far right. And the reason why this happens is that they'll say obviously blatantly racist and sexist trolling things. Other people will leave.
Yeah.
You might think that this is noise. It doesn't seem like noise to me. It seems like it's a signal that these views can be set here and you
Okay.
won't be censored. And then other people with those views hear the signal and come. It seems like fake news is gonna work the same way.
Cool.
So it's like a predominantly right-wing thing that's repeated in the right-wing enclaves. That's a signal
Mhm.
that people with these political views are welcome here and can share their views. Other people hear that signal and leave if they don't hear the politics.
Okay.
And I think this is a particular challenge to your claim that people form enclaves to avoid fake news, where
Yeah.
it seems like actually fake news is involved in creating the enclaves of it's sending the signal like people with these political views are welcome here.
I think with respect to the latter point, these processes are presumably more interlocked than that. Like the one is the effect of the other,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
But okay, so what I'm getting from this is I think we mean slightly different things by signal and noise here, right? Where yeah, sure, I get what you're saying, that it sends a signal in one sense of it being a signal that is recognizably something you can use to infer that here's a place we can go to talk about these things. What I mean by signal is something more like carries truth or something like that, right? So noise is the stuff that distracts you from the truth, the signal is the truth, or whatever other thing you want to substitute as being the value of communication. Of course, there are more aspects to communication than merely communicating truth, so you could think that dog whistles are signals too, right? But that doesn't make it a signal in the technical sense that I had in mind. So, but thank you for letting me clarify that, because I see why that could be something to get hung up on.
I'm actually, that's my question now. So my question actually picks up on Adam's question a little bit. So it's just really a clarificatory question about the type of explanation you want to be producing here. And there's something I was thinking about during the talk, and also something I thought about just reading this literature, that a few different questions seem sometimes run together.
Yeah.
So when you said to Adam, you said the main question you want to ask, at least as I understood, seemed to be almost one. It's a question we might call, what's the intentions behind the actors of creating? So that's one question we can ask. I wonder though, if you're thinking about fake news as a distinctly political phenomenon, if there are actually other questions that are maybe slightly more interesting. So one could be, forgetting the intentions that people have, what's the best explanation of the motivation to create it? And then maybe we could ask other questions too, like what are the epistemic distortions involved in creating the sort of downstream causal? And I wonder if these sort of questions need to be sort of clearly cried apart.
So the downstream distortions, I feel like I did talk about, the polarization, et cetera, right? Now, interestingly enough, I mean, it's another feature of this literature that they will say something that resembles a bit what I just said, and they will say, and therefore we all stand to lose out on important social goods because our beliefs are less good than they would be. But of course, I don't know, that depends on what your starting point would be, right? If you're actually filtering out the bad stuff and by luck ending up with all the good stuff, then you're presumably better off than you would have been otherwise. So I don't think it's necessarily true that you end up with worse beliefs than any reasonable metric of worse beliefs by going that way. But of course, it doesn't seem like, for the purposes of the epistemology of democracy, at least, it doesn't seem like the kind of process that you want. So to what extent this truth tracking is one thing, to what extent it actually harmonizes the will of the polity is a different thing. And in democracy, we need to think about both the truth dimension and about the bringing people together dimension. So the first question you have was more like, well, so there's the intentions behind producing. But then the question was like, why would they want to have what's the motivations for having
I
intentions in the
think
first
I
place?
kind of agree with that, and it seems a kind of empirical question.
Yeah.
What motivates particular actors to do anything? I mean, it's kind of
Yeah, sure, but I mean, then we look at their actions and then
Yeah.
we offer some inferences based on what seems
Yeah.
likely, based on the kinds of actions they undertake, plausible motivations we could. And of course, it could say that's, philosophers have nothing to contribute there. I would say that we do. This would be an attempt at doing that. But with respect to what would motivate someone to spend their time putting out a product that could plausibly get in the way of efficient political conversation, I can imagine there being a lot of these motivations out there. I can think about a lot of people who, for one reason or another, find that their political interests are not best served by, broad demographic or cross demographic engagement on issues of public policy and so on. I want to stop that from happening to the best of their ability.
We can talk more about
Yeah,
it.
sure. I mean,
But a lot of the motivation might just be, particularly if you think about it in social media, it's just a sort of financial motivation. You
Yeah,
want to create
that's there
content
too.
that has
Yeah,
an-
exactly. So, I mean, with respect to that too, and maybe I should say it, like, a lot of it is framed in terms of like intention to deceive and so on. And it's not like I want to say they don't intend to deceive, because I think the notion of intending to fly is just too vague a notion. I feel like plausibly, I do intend to do all the foreseeable accidental, all of them, but like, there's lots of things that I think I might not succeed in doing, but I will punt on doing anyways. And if it comes through, then I will say I intended to do that. And that seems entirely true, right? I did intend to put a hole in one, even though I didn't think I could do it. So whether or not something's within the intention of these people, I think is neither here nor there with respect to the point. What I'm interested in is like, is it primarily designed to accomplish this?
Right.
Or are they just thinking it would be a happy, fun thing if it also accomplished this, but that's not what we're primarily designed
Right,
to
see,
do.
that's helpful, yeah. Oliver.
Okay, Kirk, you're good to go. Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so really interesting talk. I thought your conclusion about institutional and public information campaigns was a little too pessimistic. There might be difficulties in instituting effective institutional reforms, but it seems to me that on balance, if we were able to have a media environment in which every platform had to, tag information that had been already identified as false or misleading and provide a source for it or rating. And if we could maybe reinstitute the FCC 1987 fairness doctrine, requiring people to provide a balanced view of any matter of great public importance. And if information campaigns could identify unreliable sources of information, and there were an independent institution that I did research on these things, and if this were pervasive and long-term, it seems to me it would have very beneficial effect. And it's true that people who have a affection for a certain view are going to resist attempts to revise it, but that's true anyway. So not doing anything clearly is not going to help, but changing the information environment in a systematic and pervasive way, it seems to me, plausibly will do some good.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I should say is I didn't mean to suggest that there is no potential benefit to it. I just wanted to point out that there are some costs to it as well, specifically costs that I think bear on the design features that we were looking for with these social media things. Anyway, the low barriers, the inclusivity, and so on. With respect to say fact checking, one thing then is, do we actually have the legal reach to impose it on every forum that we'd be interested in, like Reddit or some obscure server somewhere in some other country entirely, wherever people go when they're no longer allowed to be on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, they go somewhere else. And I suppose the idea that we would keep hunting down those forums and require of them But these don't operate on licenses. These are just like unmoderated fora somewhere. I don't know enough about this, but I have a hard time thinking that we have the institutional reach or mandate to actually impose any kind of sanction on them here. But there's also, I want to say that, politics operates at a furious speed. There is the question of quality of fact checking. So, I mean, I've seen now people go on about like, let's look at the history of Facebook fact checking during the COVID era thing, like go week by week and see what it is that it has labeled as misinformation. A lot of the stuff that it labeled as misinformation is stuff that 3 months later is going to turn out to be a perfectly respectable hypothesis, maybe even true. That's the kind of thing that I'm concerned about. And that's the kind of thing that, of course, is going to delegitimize the fact-checking mechanism in the light of a lot of users, and in the eyes of a lot of users, because it does, in many of these cases, seem like there's a particular sort of pre-established bias in the fact-checking apparatus that then leads people correctly, presumably, or at least with some reason to say, look, all kinds of views are not welcome here, and so we're going to go somewhere else. Yeah, that's a concern.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know your name.
I'm going.
Oh, I'm going.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding, about social media and fake news. You were mentioning, if I understand it correctly, there can be multiple aims for fake news. One can be persuasion, the other one can be creates this noise effect.
Yeah.
And this may be particularly true for cheap fake news. And even I agree with you to some extent that even if I want to target a population of old people, it makes more sense to make a very well done fake news for that specific target instead of a bad made fake news for that specific target. So if it's persuasion the aim, why not make always very well done fake news for every group? Yeah. But I was thinking that fake news can reach people on social media or in different ways. Or I get a fake news because the algorithm tells social media that I'm the perfect target for that fake news, or just something went viral. And if something is viral, I'm gonna get it anyway, even if it's not in my case. It seems to me that cheap fake news tend to go viral much more easily because they can be shared also for the same reason that are funny, or you share them easier with your friends. So seems that there is an advantage in the design of cheap fake news. You make them more viral, making them viral. In that sense, can reach also more easily more people. In that way, would be also a persuasive effect for them. So this is
okay. So you try to compensate for the low intrinsic credibility by reaching wider. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I would have to study it closer to know that that's actually a fact rather than just something that seems plausible. It's an interesting aspect of it. I hadn't thought about it that way. But again, what I want, right, is just to sort of suggest that bad fake news isn't just a bad attempt at making good fake news. Right? There's plausibly other things going on here that explain why they are apparently incompetent at their job, if that were their job. What could it be? And here's the suggestion.
Thank you. I'd like to get back to Katie's suggestion that, or what I took to be, that what look like epistemic bugs might be political features.
Okay.
And in particular, so you've been talking about this largely in terms of communication, and I'm wondering how much communication really is the game here. Insofar as it looks like, I mean, this is getting back to, I think, what you called the big fat fuck you. Which seems to be a big part of American.
It's also communicative, I would say, but
or
expressive.
Rather well, okay. That it's this. I think. Once you've reached a certain level of partisan division, right? However, we got to that. Now, what you say and what you believe becomes more and more an expression of fealty or allegiance. And then at that point, say the transparency of the bullshit or the absurdity of it now becomes a selling point, because anyone can believe some, fairly plausible lie about, Hillary Clinton or something. But pedophile rings, avocado, it's like that takes real commitment to say it, and it takes real commitment. Only the true believers will buy that. And I mean, again, it's one thing to say,
No, this is like wearing a shirt in public with some, really, I get it. This
Yeah,
is it's
right.
fairly insignificant.
and in that case, the fact that, oh, this doesn't seem to be getting better in
Yeah.
time, seems to be becoming more transparent or more absurd or more extreme, doesn't, if it's hard, would make perfect sense if this has now shifted out of any sort of epistemic role
Yeah.
to these performative and identity constituting roles.
Excellent. All right, good.
So that's an alternate hypothesis.
So I believe in most of what you say. And I do hope and think that I can make that as it were compatible with just another layer of that story. So one thing you could think then, well, that might be a bit optimistic, is that what I'm doing is telling maybe part of the story of how it came to be that way, right? How we did come to be so polarized that we didn't even care about the truth of the things that we said. But
Well,
failing
you
that,
care about it, but you
Yeah.
speak the absurdity, right?
Yeah.
This is Kierkegaard, right? This is
but of the
This is
things we say,
subjectivity.
we don't say them because we think it's healthy to say truth necessarily and so on, but it's more like, so when have you ever met Liverpool fans in English football, for instance? They will say things that are clearly manifestly false about the superiority of their teams to any other team. And then everyone else asks and says, do they really believe this? Right? Or is it just like somehow this is what it takes to have allegiance to Liverpool, is that you're willing to say these kinds of things, but I'm not gonna believe it. Just as an example, sorry too. Everyone has to be like, yeah, that's right. So I think it's true. Part of what you're saying here, that there's an aspect of and if you don't want to call it communication, then some kind of expressive signaling that does take this kind of stuff and thrives on driving down the intrinsic credibility even more, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the point at which, it ceases being fake news and more becomes sort of grotesque fan fiction or something like that, right? Is that sort of a fluid point where one thing leads into the other, or is it a categorically different phenomenon that just has similar shape to it? I don't know. I would have to think more about it. But I do think that at the end of the day, we're going to see a situation where we're no longer going to assume that people, for the most part, believe the things that they're willing to say in public. And I think we're at that stage now. And I think, sometimes we look at ourselves on the other side of the political spectrum too. And we also have, songs and dances that we ritually do, even though we don't know that they're true and so on, right? But so it might not be as expressly there as other people, but yeah. Okay. That's where we're in.
Okay.
So I like this as like part of the, explanation of it, whether it's intended or not, like how it functions.
Yeah.
Certain kind of effect. So on. Well, I guess they go back to Czar's question earlier, right, where it's about this. Do you think it's like confusion in the sense of like fear of, however you want to put it, breakdown or undermining of traditional values, let's say, or something like that. It makes me wonder to what extent. It's an interesting question. To what extent is fake news like almost more of an aesthetic phenomenon, right? So like, I guess I'm just having this in mind, but read it somewhat recently. But like, Jeremy Waldron's work on hate speech and like political aesthetics, right? Like, there's something the just society looks like, feels like, and so is there? Is there like a certain kind of aesthetic that's tied to this? Is it like an aesthetic of the truth is, I don't know, like bad or something, if it's tied to the white tower or ivory tower, academic jerk.
Well, I mean, they're also not speaking the truth, right? Because they're bound by we're the ones who are speaking the truth. So there's a certain kind of satisfaction, right, in being politically incorrect because you're sticking to the libs and so on. So part of that discourse, I think, is to some extent truth we're governed by some norm of truth. These people genuinely think that they have the truth, and that they're trying to cut through political convention and correctness norms in pursuing it. On the other hand, like we were just talking about here, I also think you can come detached from that, and how it just becomes performance art of a certain kind, where like, you know, but where to draw the line, and whether these are forms of expression that naturally leads one to the other, or whether they're just like they have some superficial similarities but are completely, as it were, you know, pulling in opposite directions. I don't really know. I mean, I would have to think more about it. It would be a satisfying thing, right? If the kind of cynicism that gives up on truth altogether and just makes it, you know, an outrage machine follows naturally as a last stage of this. But I don't have good arguments that's clear at this point. Entirely speculative. And like all my other things, which are not speculative at all.
So a brief follow-up?
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up. So, yeah, maybe I'm not like ready to go so far as to call an aesthetic phenomenon, but we're just going to think about that more. But like, one thing I didn't think about was like, there's tons of different kinds of political speech that involve lying, and like fake news, insofar as it is a distinct phenomenon, seems to be like not truth irrelevant, but it's like playing dirty with the truth, like in a way that, like, you know, as someone who has a podcast where they're like, women are incompetent, that's the kind of deep-seated, you know, view that you want someone to hold forever. But fake news is strange because you can have like the stop the count, keep the count kind of thing going, where it's like there's tons of contradictions. You know, it's just like it's always flip-flopping. And again, that's why I think confusion is so infinite, because like that's what seems to be, you know,
but not first order confusion about a particular proposition,
right?
But confusion about larger areas of political discourse and social life in general.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, I guess there's some follow-up.
Your second question.
Picks up on Zara's point. Let's set aside, I guess I still have doubts about whether the ones that you think are just low quality are aimed at persuading, aren't in fact aimed at persuading. But let's set that aside. The positive program where it is like creating noise of a certain kind. I'm wondering about other possible readings of what the aim is, even if it's not persuading. So like, here's another possibility. The aim is to widen the Overton window so large that anything gets through. And that lets the grandma that Zara was talking about just hold on to her view without considering anything else, because the Overton window is the whole wall, right? Like there's no more wall left there.
So there is take on this, which is not as sophisticated as your take, because it doesn't involve the Overton window. But it tries to frame something like it in terms of relevant alternatives, or something like that. So epistemology of relevant alternatives theory is this idea that you don't know P unless you can rule out all of the relevant alternatives to P. So what fake news would be doing, right, is exploding the set of relevant alternatives, because it is presented there. And being presented is the mechanism by which alternatives become relevant, apparently, in this theory. And so we stand to lose out on our epistemic justification, because, you know, you can defeat this or that, but you can't defeat the hundreds of alternatives that now out there. So I take it that you have a somewhat more sophisticated version of the same, which is like, it gives ideas a slim kind of hold on our public imagination well past their due date. Right? Or it gives the appearance that someone out there thinks this is a reasonable thing, therefore it is a reasonable thing for the purposes of our
They where they are. It's not.
Yeah, no, it's possible that that's a factor there too. I mean, I don't want to rule out every other possibility here, right? But I do want to see, here's a distinctive kind of mechanism that we haven't thought about, that I think plausibly captures at least a fair bit of it. But would do so in a very different manner than what we have been supposing when we're focusing on individual cognizers and the groups of experiences.
I mean, again, this is just like a brief comment again, like, I mean, I can't help but go back to Zara's original question. It's like the ability to just reject responsibility for these further views. And like, I think we're just getting really close to doing analysis of like, with the open window expanding, this also just enables people to put on like a mask of irony. Like this is the kind of metaphor that I see very often in like commentary about matches and reactionary politics. Like, it's not even necessary that people actually believe a set of problematic views, but also that they're capable of just like, oh, seeing what the response is. Like I see this analysis of Tucker Carlson all the time. Like he'll hedge about something, and then we get in trouble for it. Be like, no, I'll just take a ledgy or something, right? I don't know if there's that. I think there's like a weird relation between that and noise, as you put it, like that particular relation. Like I could see noise as enabling that kind of move, but I don't know. I mean, that's just a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to Tucker Carlson, that's a strategic move also to avoid litigation, right? Is it time?
No, sorry.
But yeah, so
I thought I put it on do not disturb. I'm sorry.
I wonder sometimes about like, there's this phenomenon that we all recognize where suddenly our Facebook feed started popping up with all these stories about all kinds of random stuff. This is the thing that we call fake news. We were worried about where's this coming from. We started thinking, oh, does this mean that people believe this stuff? Like, could it be so stupid, et cetera, et cetera? And then governmental organizations got in on it, basically affirmed that people are stupid enough to get into it, because why else would we be, printing these manuals for avoiding it and so on. There's that, but then there's also what, so then I have this theory about how this might lead to the shrinking of, enclaves, et cetera, et cetera. So then, there's the question of what then these peers that have sort of self-selected into these groups, how they will communicate in fora where they know that there's a chance that, activists from the other side is going to be there and take screenshots. So, they're going to involve, a bit of strategic communication there as well, because they don't want their employer to know about what they're doing, right? So there's going to be a lot of coded communication, a lot of dog whistles, even there, a lot of mechanisms to retract if you need to. But whether that sort of occurs against the common ground, where it's known that these are the things we say, even if we pretend to be ironic while we say it, that would be an interesting question for philosophers of language to get into.
I mean, just like,
because I do think it exists.
one sentence comment, but I feel like this interesting to be kind of offered here because it seems to be fundamentally playing with the distinction between signal and noise.
Yeah.
Right. Like something like irony seems more like noise. It's everywhere.
Yeah, that's the whole point of coded communication, though, or is because you're communicating always against the background of common knowledge, common ground, right? Then we are aware that there are going to be, especially on internet fora, there's going to be eavesdroppers that are pretending to be part of the conversation that are not. So we want to guard ourselves against them a little bit. So we then engage in a coded form of communication where we say things in a certain way so that we can retain plausible deniability if it were to be screenshotted and sent to your employer. But between us, we know that this is just the language that we deploy, but really what the actual communication is. So Liz Camp has a wonderful paper on insinuation that sort of got me thinking about these ways of doing it.
We have time for one very last quick question by John.
Oh, okay.
Quick one, yes.
I think this is largely just like a friendly kind of suggestion, but I wonder what you think of it. So, so your paper or your talk really focused on the way in which adjusting the signal to noise ratio can lead to these echo chamber effects, right? But it seems like another way that affecting the signal to noise ratio can really be really bad for collective inquiry is just because, when there's this fake news story where there's so little substantive to actually disagree about, what does it actually do? Well, it invites people on different, political ends to just start like making fun of each other.
Yeah.
Right. Really, lots of people spend. It's not that they disengage when there's this story; they actually engage. Like they spend so much time making fun of each other.
So it's a distraction.
And right, and so a buildup of animosity.
And this becomes the token for how stupid the other people are because look at them.
That's right. Right.
And that's kind of what the ping pong pizzeria story has become for us on the left side, right? It's become the emblem of how gullible people on the other side are. Notwithstanding the fact that we've never actually we've done tests to see how many of them actually believe in the system.
Right, yeah, right, and so this isn't meant to undermine
No,
anything, but it's
yeah.
just that there are actually multiple routes
Yeah.
that the, you know,
Yeah, I
the
think
signal
that's
to noise
fine.
ratio
Yeah.
might have these bad effects.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking.